Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup, this for the week of the 4th to 10th of January 2021. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host John DeVille. We would like to first take a moment to send a special shout-out to our friends at Go Taikonauts and at spacewatch.global, two excellent sources for space industry news. This week, we will bring you updates on the China manned space program's announcement for a low-cost cargo spacecraft. We will bring you an update on quantum communication via satellite. But first, some announcements from CASC at one of their beginning of 2021 company meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
The first piece of news this week comes from the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, or CASC. The company had their sort of beginning of company meeting for the year 2021, during which time they made a number of announcements for their ambitions for the year. So the big headline announcement that we saw was the company's plans for 40 launches during the course of 2021. This would be a new high for CASC for a year, and it would possibly make them the leader in 2021, depending on how many launches SpaceX is able to have, but certainly will be a very impressive total. In addition to this 40 launch figure that was mentioned, also just one last point regarding this 40 launch figure. So this would only include the number of launches from CASC in 2021. It does not include Expace or any of China's commercial launch companies. So again, big piece of news with this 40 launches. Other things mentioned by CASC during this sort of beginning of the year annual meeting were several of the technologies that CASC was going to emphasize over the course of this year, and several other kind of policies that the company was going to look at. So this included phrases like batch manufacturing, which we have been seeing increasingly used in the context of commercial space. So this, making 10 or 15 satellites at a time, or making just more than one. Enhanced product quality and acknowledgement that there's increasing pressure from commercialization of space, which requires CASC to make more efforts for cost control. So basically a pretty interesting kind of mixed message here from CASC at the beginning of 2021. So this big figure for the number of launches expected, there's obviously a lot of excitement. There's a lot more focus, I think, on the Chinese space industry now than there was, say, 2 or 5 years ago. And as a lot of people say in China, space is CASC and CASC is space. So the increased focus on missions like Chang'e, this is really an increased focus and to some extent an increased pressure on CASC. And so you have this, again, this kind of mixed message of, big year planned, 40 launches, but at the same time, this increasing pressure, not just from, from this media and from more people watching space, but also from commercial companies. We have cost pressures. So a lot of different things going on. And certainly, I think overall, probably a more positive than negative meeting. I mean, I think CASC is very excited for what's going to be a big year. But certainly a lot of indications of the ways that the industry is changing now. I think, and if reading between the lines, you do see a lot of support for things like increased commercialization, increased involvement of commercial companies, this kind of thing. So yeah, a big piece of news here, I think, with CASC making these announcements at the beginning of the year. And again, this core kind of argument that is existing in China of this desire for the state-owned part of the industry and sort of the traditional part of the industry to maintain control and to maintain capabilities, but then at the same time, this need to innovate more quickly and to innovate at a lower cost and to have more commercial companies involved. So definitely something to keep an eye on and something to think about a little bit in the context of China. So Jean, I think there would have been something similar announced this week as it relates to the China manned space program. Do you want to take us into that or yeah?
Sure. And definitely a lot of interesting stuff. China's state-owned and state-led apparatus. So there was the meeting that you mentioned with CASC. That was on the 4th of January. And barely 2 days later, on the 6th of January, we had China's manned space agency publish basically a request for proposals regarding a so-called low-cost cargo spacecraft, which is an unprecedented move in China, where things in space usually happen behind closed doors. And when there is a spacecraft that's to be built, basically we just get the announcement of who is the main contractor and what he is going to build. So really a big shift in the publication of this statement by the CMS. And if we try to dig a little bit deeper into the statement, basically today, this year in 2021, this is the first year of the 2 years that we'll see the assembly of the Chinese space station. And notably this year we'll have the core module, the Tianhe module, that will be launched on board a Long March 5B in the next coming months. And next year we'll see 2 experimental models, Wentian and Mengtian, that will be launched as well and be assembled. And so with any crewed space station, such as the Chinese space station, comes, of course, a crewed spacecraft as well as a cargo spacecraft. And those are respectively the Shenzhou capsule and the Tianzhou spacecraft. And so basically China already actually has these spacecraft and that are operational. The Tianzhou, for example, flew for the first time in 2017, but apparently it is looking also for lower cost commercial alternatives. And now if we just try to look a little bit closer at the Tianzhou, the currently operational cargo spacecraft of CASC, basically, it puts 6.5 pressurized tons of cargo to the Chinese space station. And that's really massive when you think of it. When you compare it to the Dragon cargo, for example, for the ISS, I think the Dragon spacecraft puts 6 tons. And if you look at the Cygnus cargo spacecraft, it puts something between 2 or 3 tons. So really, Tianzhou is really a massive spacecraft. And that's even more true if you take into account the fact that the Chinese space station is much smaller than the ISS. I think there will be 3 taikonauts permanently on there, as opposed to the ISS where you have 7. So it's not oversized, but it was clear in the statement that the Tianzhou would really be for the main supply runs, and that there would need to be a smaller scale alternative for our cargo resupply. And when we look at the requirements of what was published on the 6th of January, basically the CMS is looking for a spacecraft that has a payload cap of somewhat between 1 to 4 tons. There's a possibility also, it needs to have the ability to deorbit waste, and its cost needs to be aligned with the international standards. That's why it's called low-cost commercial cargo spacecraft. And something that's interesting as well, it needs to return something between 100 and 300 kilograms of payload back to the ground. And this is an ability that the Tianzhou spacecraft, as far as I know, is not able to do. So that's really a new arrow in the quiver for the Chinese manned program. And ultimately, last thing in the statement, the final, the deadline for this proposal for any company would have to be on the 28th of February, 2021. So that's quite a short deadline. Now, I think the natural question that arises and that's on the lips of everyone is this for China a COTS moment? COTS being the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services policy and program from NASA that dates back to 2006, and which really initiated the fact that NASA would leave cargo supply and sending crew members into space and to the ISS to private companies. And that's when we had SpaceX, Orbital Sciences, and Sierra Nevada company selected for cargo. So I mean, this policy is widely regarded as something that was rather successful from a timeline point of view, and also in terms of cost. So, I mean, it would make sense if China got some inspiration from some of the more successful U.S. policies regarding commercialization. Just last thing before I pass it on to you, Blaine. My personal thoughts regarding if this is open to private companies or not, as was COTS back in the days in the US. I think there are pros and cons here. There's really a debate on the internet. I think there are quite a few cons. The first one would be that the formulation in this statement was 单位. So 单位basically meaning unit. And I have a feeling that we're more talking about various institutes of the state-owned apparatus rather than a private company. So that's the first thing. The second con is the fact that any private company would need to have significant skills, experience, and financial resources to actually provide a proposition that holds together. And this is not the case today. We're at very low level of maturity so far for a lot of the Chinese private companies. And when you look at the companies that were selected for in the US in 2006, it was Orbital Sciences, definitely not a small company, Sierra Nevada Corporation, same thing. SpaceX admittedly was a startup back then, but backed up by a billionaire like Elon Musk. So yeah, basically those are the cons. There are some pros, I would guess, and The first one is just the fact that China has published such a statement. This is really the first time. As I said, usually this happens behind closed doors. And so this would mean that there is maybe some space for commercial companies. And I think the only one that comes to mind that would have the ability to do this is probably CASC. So CASC, admittedly another state-owned company, but it's not CASC, the historical contractor for this sort of stuff. It has the financial resources, the skills, and it's already been exploring for, I say, half a decade, commercial space initiatives such as Expace for launch and other initiatives for a communication satellite. So yeah, that's. Well, I'd like to have your thoughts, Blaine, on this. Like, what do you think of private companies or just commercial companies in general playing a bigger role in China's manned crewed space program?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely, and apologies if my phone is ringing in the background. I hope it's not too disruptive for any of our viewers or listeners. But I think that definitely the wording and the timeline of this announcement is not. It's not terribly surprising. So to your point, I mean, mentioning that the bid would need to be submitted by February 28th of this year for something that is obviously quite complicated. So I really do think there would not be so many companies that would be able to do this. That being said, I do think that you're right to say it's noteworthy in that it is as open and seemingly transparent as it is. So, and I definitely agree with you that CASC would be very high on my list of companies that I would expect to get involved here. But just thinking about, I guess, how sprawling and how sometimes disparate the business interests of China's SOEs are, it may not be limited to CASC. I mean, granted, for this specific opportunity, probably it may be, but just to take an example, so at the moment, I remember about a year and a half ago now, I went to go visit CASC in Shanghai, and CASC, they make the what do you call it? The thing which makes the area between the module and the space station pressurized, basically, the sort of the airlock kind of pressurization kind of a thing. So they make this. And so, CASC, they make this thing. They're one of the only companies in China that can make this. But then CASC also makes like other very high tech, but seemingly totally unrelated things. Like they're trying to make hydrogen fuel cells or like other kind of batteries for cars, this kind of thing. And again, that's coming from the company that does make, these, again, drawing a blank on the word, but these airlocking things that go on the space station, they're doing a lot of other things. Now, granted, you could argue that things on the Chinese space station are kind of the most high-tech of high-tech, and you'd probably be not entirely wrong. But digressing, you have a lot of state-owned companies that have a lot of technological resources and a lot of money and a lot of engineers that seemingly do now potentially have the ability to compete for these types of contracts. And so I agree that right now this is probably, we're unlikely to see any, purely commercial company bid for this particular contract. But it's a step in the right direction, I think, from a kind of purely opening the industry up to more competition. Because really, I mean, I think 2 years ago, this would have just been completely given to CASC or to some, basically would have given to CASC with no open competition or anything. I mean, this is a step in the right direction, I think. So definitely.
I think it's also a good sign, I think, for Chinese space companies, commercial space companies, because there's been questions over the 4 or 5 past years of what would be the business model of these various commercial companies, how they would earn money, and how fragile these business models were. And here, what you have here would be, basically the Chinese government, which would be a great customer. It's good money. It would be, on a regular basis, and probably there'd be a binding contract. And so, this is really a great way to make some of these private companies grow. Basically, a really solid customer for these private companies.
Yeah, and again, I'm kind of just, when you take a step back and look at this, it's pretty amazing to see that the Chinese manned space program basically said, yeah, we have this requirement, and if you can do this and this and this and this within this amount of time, you have a deal. We don't really care who you are. So that's definitely unusual and a step in the right direction. That's good stuff. Shall we move on to quantum? Space to ground quantum communications.
Absolutely. That's also a very exciting piece of news. China published on the 7th of January an article in the very famous journal Nature about the feasibility of quantum key distribution from a space-to-ground optical comms perspective. So just a little background on this paper. The universities that were involved were the University of Science and Technology of China, that's based in Hefei, that's in Anhui province. We also had the Shanghai Institute of Technical Physics, and ultimately there was also the Jinan Institute of Quantum Technology, Jinan being the provincial capital of the province of Shandong, if I'm not wrong. And basically the works and the conclusions that were in this paper that was published earlier this month, they were based on the quantum experimental satellite, also nicknamed Mozi, that was launched by China in 2016. And the idea behind quantum key distribution, just a few words on that, although that's definitely not my area of expertise, is overall you have two parties that generate and send to each other a key through optical comms and through a certain quantum key distribution algorithms. And the quantum nature of this communication means that if there's a third party that's trying to eavesdrop on the basically the transmission of these of the quantum of the key, basically the secret key, well, the initial two parties would be aware, because this modifies the quantum nature of the information that's communicated. Basically, that makes an unbreakable way of communicating a secret code. Because if you realize that you've been eavesdropped on, you throw away the old key and just generate a new secret key. And quantum key distribution is something that that was theorized and that's existed for at least 3 or 4 decades. So it's not something new. But the challenge here is to make it work over long distances. And I think so far it's only been done through fiber optic networks on the ground, never space to ground. And a lot of things can go wrong, because you can have atmospheric turbulence, and you can have background light. You can have a lot of things that make things go wrong and just change the message of the secret key that's transmitted between the 2 points. And so what China did basically is that they combined 2 ground stations that they had in China, separated by 2,600 kilometers. They also had 2,000 kilometers of fiber optics on the ground. And when they put all this together, they were able to achieve quantum key distribution over a total distance of 4,600 kilometers. So definitely a world first. The precedent record that did not have space ground comms at all, I think was several hundred kilometers. So that's a big breakthrough. And what I also got from some of the papers that were discussions that followed the publication of this paper was that the next step for the Chinese is to work on and to launch potentially more low-cost quantum key distribution satellites, and also to work on cost-efficient terminals. Probably the idea behind there is to, at some point, to commercialize these technologies. They're also looking into increasing the key generation data rate. I think it's several dozen kilobits per second at the moment. And final thing, they're also looking into doing the same type of experiment, but with higher orbit satellites. So Mozi in 2016 was put into low Earth orbit. The idea is that if you can put the same technology into medium Earth orbit or to geostationary Earth orbit, you're much higher and you're able to achieve quantum key distribution over much wider territory and much larger distances. So basically, you can imagine transcontinental quantum key distribution. Although I think that we still have to wait a few years before we see that, especially at a commercial level. So, yeah.
Although to that point, in Asia Pacific, you have seen already to now, I don't think they've actually had tests of the technology, but they've talked about having a lot of R&D in this area, is KTSat, so the South Korean satellite operator that it's a wholly owned, I believe, subsidiary of KT, the Korean telco. And there were a couple of articles in 2018 and 2019 where KTSat's CEO at the time was talking about the company wanting to use quantum key distribution as a way of sort of multicasting information in a way that is secure, as you have just described. So basically this idea of being able to have highly secure information broadcast from some central node up to a geosatellite and then multicast to a number of different points. So that was certainly... Again, I'd seen 1 or 2 talks by people from KTSat at either, I don't remember if it was APSCC conference or Communicasia, but it is something that the South Koreans have also been looking into. And I do think that despite, to your correct point that we're still quite a few years away from this being kind of a commercialized technology, I think it's not terribly surprising to see that China and South Korea are two countries that are really taking the lead here. I think they have some similarities in terms of like having comparatively large R&D budgets, also comparatively large military budgets, and also this kind of trying to do a lot of cutting edge technologies domestically, having that technology, in-house, as it were. So yeah, definitely still quite a few years away. I don't think 2021 is going to be the year of the quantum key distribution, but certainly it's an interesting publication to see in Nature, and we'll be keeping an eye on that for sure. Anything else from your side, John, on QKD?
Nope, that's about it for me for this week.
Great. Well, this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. Please be on the lookout for our upcoming interview with Dong Lu from ComSat, which should be released probably this week. I don't want to overpromise, but this week should be on the lookout. And other than that, thank you very much for listening. We will see you next week on the Dongfang Hour.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.